After conducting the decennial census in 1890, a bulletin of the United States Census Bureau reported that American settlements had penetrated the American frontier to such a degree that a frontier really did not exist anymore. This report marked the closing of a long and momentous epoch in American history. For since Europeans had first landed on the shores of North America, the one constant across the shifting social and political conditions of the centuries had been the reality of the frontier, a boundary line where lands under European or later American organization terminated and the unsettled wilderness of the American Indian tribes began. The closing of the frontier represented the end of a reality that had been part of American life for 4 centuries. The occasion prompted a historian of the University of Wisconsin named Frederick Jackson Turner to reflect on the role of the frontier in the development of America, and the result was a paper entitled The Significance of the Frontier in American History, which Turner read before the American Historical Association in Chicago in 1893. Turner's paper argued for a theory that has become known as the Frontier Thesis. Turner's Frontier Thesis would become the dominant paradigm for understanding America's westward expansion throughout much of the 20th century, and was deeply influential in creating the mythos of the American West that was so popularized in the pulp serials and Western films of the 40s and 50s. In this video, we will explore Turner's Frontier Thesis in order that we might better understand how the frontier has shaped and continues to shape our consciousness of what it means to be an American. Given the tremendous impact of the thesis, we might expect Turner to be aiming for something grandiose. His aim, however, is much more modest. Turner expressed frustration with the prevailing histories of the United States, which he believed focused too much on politics. He also criticized the tendency of histories in his day to treat the Atlantic coastal states as the focal point for American development. Turner believed the answer to this imbalance was the frontier, the ever-advancing line of westward expansion that had defined the geographical expansion of the country. Turner was interested in how the geographical reality of the frontier intersected with other aspects of American development, whether social, economic, or political. These are obviously lofty goals which Turner recognized. His paper is therefore not an attempt to study the subject exhaustively, but merely draw attention to the frontier as a fertile field for investigation, in hopes of creating a more holistic way to view the development of the United States. The original settlement of America by the Europeans was profoundly, European, what Turner calls European germs developing in an American environment, like seeds transplanted from one garden to another. The earliest settlements along the Atlantic coast and the St. Lawrence were little replicas of Europe. Settlers were European in dress, industries, tools, modes of travel, and thought. Even the colonial nomenclature pointed straight back to Europe: New France, New England, New Brunswick, New Amsterdam, New Hampshire, Plymouth, and so on. But the movement west into the American hinterlands entails a stripping away of European identity as new environments, experiences, and challenges force settlers to adapt to new ways of doing things. Pushing out into the untamed wilderness, the European settler is deprived of his ancestral lifeways and is confronted with what Turner called frontier conditions. The challenges of settling Appalachia were different from those settling the Atlantic coast, just as those of settling the Great Plains were different from those of Appalachia. Each successive step westward draws out innovation. Innovation in how land is settled, how resources are utilized, how native tribes are dealt with, how society is organized. Each frontier served as a guide for the development of the next. Turner sees these innovations as giving rise to the uniquely American way of life. The further west one goes, the less European and more American one becomes. This is important as it ties into the ever-elusive question of American identity. In a country where everybody here has come from elsewhere, and remember, even American Indian tribes came from Asia originally, what does it mean to be American? Is there a uniquely American identity that exists apart from the various constitutive cultures that came here? Turner says yes. American identity, as Turner understands it, consists in European foundations transformed and developed by frontier conditions into something new. It is a reality that is both conservative and innovative, preserving core aspects of European civilization while innovating based on the necessities imposed by frontier life. Now, writing in 1893, Turner is, of course, predicating this of white America only, and so as a comprehensive explanation for all American identity, it is obviously insufficient and is often criticized on these grounds. But that does not mean it is untrue as an explanation for European American development. Furthermore, the basic principle applies as well to other peoples, whether we are discussing Chinese immigrants on the West Coast, Mexican migrants in the Southwest, or even the African slave experience. The more any people were compelled to adapt to frontier conditions, the less their lifeways resembled those of their homelands. We can see then that for Turner, the frontier is a powerfully formative influence on the American nation. It finds people still in the cultures of their homelands, strips away what is no longer useful for the exigencies of frontier life, and molds them into something entirely different. And the process is more accelerated to the degree that frontier conditions prevail. Although Turner speaks of a frontier line, we must not mistake his idea of the frontier as a static one. Turner's frontier is a dynamic concept, fluid and fluctuating, spreading not in a uniform movement, but in pockets of settlement. In fact, talk about the frontier is mere convention, as Turner identifies multiple frontiers. This is, of course, true in the geographic sense. The frontier does not expand directly westward, but moves in multiple directions simultaneously, including at various times north and south. But more importantly, at any given time, there are multiple types of frontier, existing simultaneously in different regions. Turner views frontier conditions on a spectrum, from raw wilderness to agricultural settlement. Along this spectrum, he identifies three types of frontier: the trader's frontier, the rancher's frontier, and the farmer's frontier. These frontiers correspond to the types of individuals who settle there. First, into the raw wilderness come the traders, dealing in furs trapped or bartered with the natives. After trading routes and outposts have been established, next come the ranchers and miners, seeking wide open spaces for pasturage or to search for precious metals. The presence of ranching and mining eventually draw the third group of settlers, the farmers, who put the land under cultivation and bring it under conventional methods of property ownership. After the farmers comes the development of urban life and industry, by which point a region cannot be said to be in frontier conditions any longer. These three frontiers may exist simultaneously in different areas. For example, in the 1850s, Minnesota was a farmer's frontier, while Nebraska was a ranching frontier, and somewhere like Idaho would have been a trader's frontier. What differentiated each frontier was the type and intensity of land use. Turner describes what he calls a threefold exploitation of the environment. Now, today, exploitation tends to have a negative connotation, but Turner simply means the productive use of a resource. The trader's frontier is characterized by the exploitation of beasts, the rancher's frontier by the exploitation of grasses, and the farmer's frontier by the exploitation of the soil. So the frontier expands geographically while simultaneously growing in intensity of land use, until the beginning of urbanization brings a close to frontier conditions altogether. The most controversial aspect of Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier essay is his theory about how the frontier contributes to the development of American democracy. Turner says the adaptation required by frontier conditions profoundly affected the growth of American political thought, making the frontier an overlooked factor in the development of our country's politics. Turner offers several compelling examples in favor of this thesis. The expansion of the franchise during the era of so-called Jacksonian democracy was driven by the desire of frontier states to draw settlers west. Whereas eastern states had property restrictions on who could vote, the newer western states dropped these restrictions as a carrot to incentivize westward settlement, which would in turn swell their populations and give them greater representation in the House of Representatives. In the beginning, this outraged Eastern states who continually attempted to frustrate the growing political influence of the West, even discussing secession from the Union at the Hartford Convention of 1814. Later, to compete with the Western states, the Atlantic states would eliminate their property requirements as well. Thus, frontier settlement became the catalyst for a more egalitarian franchise across the country. Another example is the debates over slavery. We may tend to think of slavery as a sectional debate between the North and the South, but Turner observes that it was actually a debate about the frontier, that is, the West. Every major flashpoint on the issue of slavery concerned the frontier. The 1820 Missouri Compromise, which was about the status of slavery in the frontier territory of Missouri. The debates over the Mexican War, which was seen as a land grab by Southern states eager to expand slavery into the frontier. The bloody violence of the 1850s in Kansas was occasioned by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed the frontier territories of Kansas and Nebraska to allow or prohibit slavery by vote. So dominant were frontier concerns in the slavery debates that Turner sees the slavery debate as an ancillary issue to the settlement of the frontier, which was really the supreme question. This turns the conventional view of the Civil War on its head. While most historians have tended to see the Civil War as a conflict over slavery, in which the frontier was a secondary concern, Turner sees it as a conflict over how the frontier would be settled, with slavery as the incidental issue that happened to be in contention. But even if we consider political development more modestly at the ground level of individual community, Turner again sees the frontier as pivotal. As each frontier was settled, a political template was carried over from earlier states. Those who settled Appalachia brought models of politics and government they had used in the East. But new conditions forced adaptations of these models. The frontier not only forced political and social adaptation, but essentially required the democratic experiment to begin anew in each successive frontier, as settlers built society from the ground up. The frontier thus reinforced a commitment to democracy in each succeeding generation, as frontier conditions ensured that the construction of a democratic society was not merely something inherited from one's forefathers, but built afresh every time a frontier was settled. As we can see, for Turner, the settlement of the frontier was a complex process involving factors social, political, and economic. The results of this process forged a unique American identity. Turner offers several examples of what this means concretely. In the first place, it gave rise to what Turner called the composite nationality of the American people, as in the crucible of the frontier, settlers were Americanized and fused into a composite nationality, as English, Germans, Swedes, Czechs, Irish, and all others intermarried. The advance of the frontier also decreased our dependence on European trade. Whereas the early coastal colonies were heavily dependent on European trade, especially in the South, the advance of the frontier created markets out of reach of European traders and gave rise to a domestic merchant class, seeing the increase in internal trade routes like the National Road, Erie Canal, or the flourishing trade along the Mississippi. In essence, the frontier made possible the creation of an autonomous economy independent of Europe. The advance of the frontier also broke down sectionalism. As New Englanders became Midwesterners, Midwesterners became Nebraskans, Missourians became Texans, and Virginians Californians, the old sectional rivalries between North, South, and the old Midwest deteriorated. As Turner said, mobility of population is death to localism. Likewise, the same process of religious mobility broke down old religious antipathies. Whereas European cities were highly segregated along religious lines, frontier communities were mixing pots where religious groups who scarcely would have interacted in Europe lived, worked, and worshipped side by side. Turner believed the frontier also produced individualism. Since frontier conditions by definition lacked many of the social supports of advanced civilization, they forced settlers to rely upon their own wits. This is the source of the idealized, rugged individualism of Americans. But Turner said it also produced an antipathy to control. The frontier experience has caused Americans to confuse individual liberty with the absence of effective government. Finally, Turner believed the frontier provided an outlet for what he called that nervous, restless energy and inherent expansive power that characterized the American spirit. Turner concludes his observations by predicting that, quote, the American energy will continually demand a wider field for its exercise. These words, penned in 1893, were prophetic, as they prefigured the imperialist conquests of the McKinley and Roosevelt eras, the global industrial domination of the United States during the mid-20th century, and the worldwide dominance of American culture in the latter 20th and early 21st centuries. The geographical frontier of the Old West has vanished, but American energy continues its expansion across new frontiers. Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis dominated American historiography for over 50 years, but after World War II became the subject of intense critique and deconstruction. Turner's thesis ignored the experiences of women and minorities who did not benefit from the frontier egalitarianism Turner lauded. The frontier experience was profoundly different for American Indians, who play no part in Turner's essay save as foils against which American settlers unite in their westward march. Turner himself later came to question aspects of his thesis, finding some of its assertions much too generalized. While Turner's thesis is certainly not beyond criticism, many of the attacks on it are unfair. It is admittedly broad, but Turner never claimed to be giving an exhaustive study of the frontier or its effects. He merely wanted to propose the frontier as a field fertile for further research and offer some preliminary points for consideration. It is true that frontier society was hardly egalitarian for women and minorities, or even for all white settlers who were often at the mercy of fraudulent land agents, unscrupulous loan sharks, and later wealthy industrialists who picked winners and losers on the frontier by controlling railroad shipping rates. Still, egalitarianism is a relative term. The inequalities of American life do not change the fact that the expansion of the frontier did mean greater freedom in many respects, even if it was still imperfect. The frontier may not have been a forge of egalitarian democracy, but it certainly provided an important impetus towards democratic development. Turner's thesis does omit the experiences of women and minorities, but in an age when the fortunes of the country were determined by white males, is it really that wrong to focus on the white male experience? We can certainly agree the experience of white males was not the whole story, but it was a major part of the story, something we should not forget just because of shifting cultural sensitivities. In the end, though it's not perfect, Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis provided a rich and compelling explanation for American development that tied together politics, economy, and culture under the banner of geography. What do you think about the Frontier Thesis? Or what other subjects would you like to see covered on Historia Verax? Leave your comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.